Okay, I've talked about this before earlier about the three-act structure of films, which is more or less the default setting of most films, most American films. So that's basically just setup, conflict, resolution. It's very, very elementary, very fundamental. So, and that's pretty much sort of the working model of how other kinds of narratives are sort of told. It's very different. It's a lot of different slang in terms of how they're nuanced, how they're stretched, or how they're broken down. But it's all stems from that whole basic model. I think it was a American filmmaker named Samuel Fuller who said that the first frame is the most important frame in a film. First frame sucks. Chances are the rest of the film does as well. It's not necessarily a golden rule, but it sort of makes sense. I think the opening sequence of a film is pretty much, because it comes at the beginning, it pretty much sets the tone for the rest of the film in one way or another. So it's a very crucial part of the film. And I'm not sure if you can like diagram how to make a very solid intro, but if you go by Sam Fuller's filmography, his opening sequences usually involve a very striking visual. Like there's the steel helmets where you have the eyes of this soldier in the sand, I think, and another film of his in which this woman is being beaten, woman is beating someone with her shoe, and then somebody grabs her hair and it comes off, and it's a wig, and she's bald, and I think it's Naked Kiss. So he sort of follows through with this rule, and I think most of the time, striking opening sequences are usually very visual. So I'm not sure if that works for all kinds of films, but it definitely sort of does for most kinds of films. What we're trying to do here is try to break a story down, but a story on film down, a film narrative down. But you have to understand that there are very different kinds of films. So one kind of intro might not work for another kind of film. Yes. So it's different tenors, different textures, different sensibilities, different moods. So when you're talking about a basic conventional melodrama, then you start off very quietly with an intro, probably introduce the characters, probably introduce the milieu, and then introduce the conflict. And then you go about showing how the characters resolve that conflict, or sometimes not resolve the conflict. But there are a lot of other films where these rules don't necessarily apply, where you have intros that have nothing to do with the rising action, that have nothing to do with the characters, but they work. So I think you can boil it down to just what I said. It's just setup, conflict, resolution is your basic diagram for a basic narrative. You can. I mentioned it earlier as part of this masterclass that when you try to write a script or a screenplay, it's very useful to go to the 3-act structure on your first draft, because it gives you a sense of the characters, the narrative, the environment, and the universe that you're trying to create. Once you've done that, on your second draft, you can play around. You can get rid of all 3 acts and just play around with the universe that you created. But it's very useful for that purpose. It doesn't necessarily mean it's useless. There are stories that demand to be told within that structure, but most stories aren't. So in terms of trying to break down a story, you can break it down in that way. But do you have to tell the story that way? Not necessarily. I think as filmmakers, especially as independent filmmakers, by implication, when we call ourselves independent filmmakers, that means we're personal filmmakers. That means we're more or less uh, making slightly more personal films. I think, and films with hopefully with a voice. So when it comes to that, when it comes down to that, that whole breakdown doesn't necessarily apply, but it does serve a purpose as a way for you to get some bearing on your work, on the thing that you created, whether it's just whatever it is, and then it's really up to you where to take it after that. In fact, the only hard fast rule is don't stick to the first draft. Okay. When you talk about story hooks, I think they're the things that you use for your trailers. But a story hook is dictated by, I think, the story itself. I mean, holistically, the story should be the hook, and it's really a function of how you craft the narrative. That's where the hooks come in, whether it's a plot twist, whether it's a memorable sequence, or whether it's a memorable character or a line of dialogue even. I think that's ultimately and should be organically dictated by how you follow your story through to the end. They make for good. They make for good trailer highlights. Some films actually write in stuff like that into the film. I mean, usually it happens within a studio setting when you're making like these big films where you have to reshoot certain scenes that have to be put into what you've already shot to give it more audience friendliness. I mean, I think that's what happened with Rogue One, and what's probably happening with JLA. So when you talk about big films, that usually happens. In Hollywood, reshoots are common for blockbusters. Even in a lot of commercial films, especially local, for example, Star Cinema, if you talk about the Star Cinema films, you usually have uh, certain certain scenes or certain devices or certain maybe lines of dialogue. I don't know what form it takes usually, but there's usually asked to be written into the script and shot and made part of the film, even if it feels a little bit extraneous or obtrusive. I'm not necessarily a fan of when that happens, but essentially a good story, whether it's an abstract or straightforward story, has to have hooks. So I think there's no like procedure to arrive at these hooks except to follow the story. Sometimes when a story isn't working, when the script isn't working, maybe you need to find whatever that is that makes it work. And usually what makes it work is a hook. But it's not something you necessarily smuggle in from outside. It has to be somewhere within the script you're already writing. So I think it's more a process of following the narrative or following the story. That's where you stumble on which hooks you might necessarily need to make it effective. Sometimes, for example, when you're writing a screenplay and you finish it, and then you decide suddenly to have a plot twist near the end, that comes as an afterthought. But it can also be very organic. So it's not embedded in the original conception, but you give it some time and maybe that'll come to you and, okay, this might need the plot twist near the end. So it really varies with each screenplay and with each writer or with each director. But ultimately, it's all about just finding the story and letting it take you to where it's supposed to go. I don't claim to be an expert in creating characters. I hope I'm already good at it, but I'm not sure. But I think the most fatal mistake, the most common mistake young screenwriters make when they're making their first screenplays is they end up writing a whole bunch of characters that sound the same, and they usually sound like the writer. Characters are very important. Creating a convincing, full-bodied character is a tricky thing because it involves you creating something or someone practically out of cloth or out from scratch. And there's this thing that writers say that you at some point you have to let the character speak to you. That sounds like so much bullshit, but it's actually kind of true. You at some point during the writing, something happens when the character starts becoming more and more full-bodied, more and more lived in. He sort of starts to speak to you in a weird, strange way, and all you have to do is to follow him or her to where he's supposed to go. That's why, personally, I never really I write straight to script, and I normally don't know how it will end. So there's this very small window where anything can happen. So I think yeah, that's a very important thing when you're developing your characters is to make sure that they are different. I mean, when I wrote Violator, I was writing about myself. I had 6 characters in a police station. They were all aspects of myself, but it was very clear, at least to me, which aspects I was talking about. So it was very clear for me to sort of push them to where they were supposed to go. There were aspects of myself at certain age, aspects of myself that I don't really necessarily want to admit to anyone, but they were there. And in case if ever you do see it, the only one that's not me is the bad guy. So, but yeah, so you that was at least my process. I'm not sure if it's foolproof. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if it will work for you. I'm not even sure if it works, but it's a way out of having to write this one-note, tone-deaf characters that don't jump off the page and won't necessarily jump off, and definitely won't jump off the screen. Now, there's a crucial part when you're writing a film. There's another part that's very crucial when you're building the character. It's when you start casting, and when the actor has been cast. And I usually ask my actors to add something of themselves in the character. I'm not very strict about how they interpret the character. I give them a it's a very basic framework. It's a very basic template, but they're free to move around inside and give a little aspect of themselves. It works differently for different actors. Like, I've worked with theater actors to ask for backstories, and I usually have some measure of backstory that doesn't make it to the script or to the screen, that I can tell the actors to feed them so they can interpret the character the way I want them to interpret. But then they're also like, sometimes movie actors, they don't need that. They just switch on and off. You just give them a basic sketch of who the character is, and then they can pull it off. So it's different strokes for different kinds of disciplines. But that's an integral part of building the character when you have the actor involved, because then it becomes more lived in, more full-bodied, literally, because now somebody's actually playing the role. So yeah, but as screenwriters, since we all start off with writing scripts, I think it's very important to check the voices of your characters. It's very important and I think the key to that is to knowing them very intimately, as intimately as you can. So the cheat there is to base it on someone you know. That's usually where the go-to technique. But but at some point it does evolve. At least for me, it does. I base it on someone, I base it on myself, and then it spins off somewhere more interesting. So That's a big help if you base it on someone that you know. Then you have a grasp of who the character is. More, you have even more of a grasp of who the character is because you know the person you based it on. So that's one thing. Another thing I think that's been useful to me is I always listen, and I always try to read books with good dialogue, even if it's in English. Then I transpose that sort of rhythm and that sort of texture to Tagalog because I write in Tagalog when I write for film. So I try to transpose that. And then I also try to listen to how people talk. Sometimes you don't, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to write in a naturalistic way. Sometimes you can write in a stylized way. But listening to how people talk can help immensely in sort of like getting a grasp on characters. So I think it's important to get the voice down pat of each character before anything else. Then once that's once that's established, I think that magic moment when you just follow them and let them speak to you will more or less happen. It's probably just in your head. It's probably just you, some hidden skill inside of us that sort of makes us believe that the character is talking to us. But it does happen, and when that happens, that's sort of where things get exciting. So I think that's the first thing. First thing is to get the voices, the character down.